I want to go back to what we were just talking about and the debt that's coming to the market and the absorption that's going to be happening. I'm looking at a story right now saying that the Bank of England is actually probing data center lending because they're worried about AI bubbles brewing. Is this something you're starting to hear about in the market, Marta?
Well, it's so interesting because a lot of the rationale for the, I guess, complacency around the AI trade has been that this is largely being funded by very well capitalized, very strong hyperscalers, and the companies are not taking on debt. They are, using what they have to extend into this space. But now, in the most, recent month, we are beginning to see more debt issuance. And I think when you think about the scale of investment and the ratio of capex to revenue that we're seeing even at the hyperscalers, it does argue that we're going to have to use a broader range of financing to meet some of the targets that we have. And of course, that's the signal that folks are looking for, that there is an AI bubble. Now, I think there's a real difference between extreme valuations, which is where I think we are, and an AI bubble. I think the sentiment has to get more aggressive. I think we would have to see far more debt issuance. I think or I guess, kind of wildness around it.
We're getting a few hits to the line, Marta. We need more compute going. I'm interested in, look, 5 trillion is what the spending's likely to be up to 2030 if we're going to get the data center and compute necessary to fuel the AI viewpoint. To that end, when you're thinking about clients coming to you saying, I want exposure, I want it to be cross-asset, right, are you saying how are you talking about the diversification between equity exposure and debt exposure, corporate bonds and the like?
Well, at this point, the primary exposure to AI is still within the equity market. I think this is something that, especially for the active credit managers, it is an opportunity to vet. You can get that added yield as suggested, but I do think people want to be really cautious in terms of adding that debt. One thing that we're talking about a lot in the credit market is just how tight spreads are. And so that is we want to watch to make sure that isn't, a valuation risk within the credit market.
Marta, earnings was a factor in this market this morning. When I came to my desk, we showed Intel actually is now basically flat. Even so, in the course of a conversation we had with Intel CFO Dave Zinsner, he made for an interesting case study, which is that he said they had been very cautious about tariffs, but the impact wasn't there in the end. And actually, in the PC segment on which they depend, shipments were very strong, stronger than they had anticipated. Just as a case study, that's really interesting data to me. What do you make of it?
It's totally interesting, and it really echoes what we've seen over the course of 2025, which is this sea change in trade policy, and yet really no discernible effect from either an earnings perspective or from an inflation perspective. Our emphasis over this period has been expecting to see some hit to earnings, less concern on the inflation front. And I think one thing that we're really learning over this process is that you can see a sea change in policy and yet not necessarily see the impact immediately. I think the concern I would raise to investors is just because you don't see an immediate impact doesn't mean there isn't an impact. When we look at the long-term implications of globalization on earnings, it has been a real positive for the US and globally. And so as we roll that back, it stands to reason that it is a headwind, maybe a headwind that we can overcome, but a headwind nevertheless.
Marta, please respond to what is one of the top news stories of the day. President Trump says he's halted trade talks with Canada because of an advertisement that they ran citing a Reagan-era comment. You're aware of it. In response, Mark Carney says that trade talks were making progress before the president's post on Truth Social. Again, as a case study of trade and policy in this market, your reaction to it?
Well, I guess I would say that trade talks are the toddler that just won't go to bed. I don't think this story is really over yet. We have a lot of certainty, I guess, in terms of the overall effective tariff rate, but the fine details of what those trade talks look like, yes, with Canada, but also, of course, there's still a lot of negotiation with China. So I think this is something that will be this kind of lingering volatility within the market.
Marta, you have a sea of parents of young children who are just feeling that pain, that analogy really beautifully. Thank you very much. I want to go back to the very start of our conversation and to say that valuations you think are extended. Where exactly and what will earnings have to vindicate which types of companies?
Well, when we're looking at the US market broadly, really every sector from our vantage point, with one exception, is quite expensive. And when we talk about expensiveness, we're looking at sectors in deciles of valuation relative to their own history. And what we're seeing is valuations that are really in those 9th and 10th deciles. And that's when that starts to matter to prospective 3-year returns. When we look under the hood in technology, we really see it across industries. Now, that doesn't mean that these stocks can't grind higher. And if we do see upside surprise within earnings, potentially that could push the stock market even further. I think the idea here is that there's just low immunity. So if we were to get an earnings season that people expect, I think that's a lot harder to move the stock market. I will do a shout out to healthcare. This is something we've been surfacing since the summer. This is one of those areas that is more attractively priced. It has a lot of problems that it faces, but it also has, the potential to benefit from something like AI. So that's one of those areas that we're looking to in this environment.